So may I start by welcoming you and thank you for coming this evening. My name is Dr. Jonathan Kirkup. I'm a senior lecturer in politics at Cardiff University and I'm the interim head of department. And first to say, this event is part of a series of roundtable discussions looking at the politics of Northern Ireland, which feeds into a wider research project on the Island of Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network. And this event has been very generously funded by GW4. So GW4 is a research network between the universities of Exeter, Bath, Bristol and Cardiff. So this evening we have a number of speakers. First of all, I'll go from my left to right, I guess. So Siobhan Fenton is a writer and political commentator on Northern Irish and British politics based in Belfast. Her work has been published in The Guardian, The Independent, The Irish Times, The New Statesman, lots of places. And she's appeared as a political commentator on, among other things, the BBC, RTE, and Sky News. From 2020 to 2024, she was a senior communications advisor for Sinn Féin. And her book, The Good Friday Agreement, is a cool reading for the module that I teach with Thomas Leahy here at Cardiff. So you get a bit of money from us. So our next is Dr. Giada Lagana, who's a politics lecturer at Cardiff and a Leverhulme Postdoctoral Fellow, looking at social spatial governance between the island of Ireland and the UK. So a book on the European Union and the Northern Ireland peace process was published in 2021, and it outlines the European Union's approach to conflict resolution and peace building in Northern Ireland. And you have a forthcoming book also looking at the civil servants and peace building in Northern Ireland, due to be published by Oxford University Press. Next to my right is Dr. Claire Rice, a postdoctoral research fellow at Edinburgh University. Claire's research interests include methods and power sharing in deeply divided places, human rights, equality, and legislative studies. In particular, Claire is interested in the politics in and around Northern Ireland, and her work looks extensively at Brexit and the constitutional future of the UK and Irish politics. So Claire completed a PhD at Queen's University in Belfast and won the Elizabeth Wiseman Prize, that's right, isn't it, for the Political Studies Association best thesis looking at inequality and social justice. And finally, we have Thomas Leahy, who's a senior lecturer in British and Irish politics at Cardiff University and works alongside me. And Thomas specialises in Irish politics, particularly the IRA, and his book also won Political Studies Awards, looking at the intelligence war against the IRA, published by University Cambridge Press. Fantastic. Right, so this evening we're going to start with Thomas just starting off, just giving a background to the troubles, to the Northern Ireland conflict. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay. So brief overview, conflict, peace process and politics in North of Ireland or Northern Ireland, whatever you want to call it. So conflict commences in 1969, but the caveat to that is Irish Republicans saw the undemocratic nature of partition by the British government and also Unionist British Protestants from 1920 as a long-term catalyst to the conflict. And actually, Irish Republicans would go back, and some Irish nationalists as well, right back into history and say the minute you start having English involvement in the affairs of the island of Ireland is a problem. So if you want to look that up back in medieval times for that, we won't do that now. So scholars generally agree then that the devolved British Protestant Ulster-Unionist government in Belfast thereafter, so after partition in 1920, implemented widespread discrimination against what we'll call the Northern Nationalist community. So by that term, I mean Irish nationalists living in Northern Ireland before 1969. A civil rights movement emerged in the 1960s, but met with Unionist resistance and state security force resistance. Intercommunal clashes emerged by August 1969, leading to British troops entering. However, they, in my view, so this is specifically in my view, turned on the Irish nationalist community to prevent a two-front conflict quite early on. So by 1972, some indiscriminate British security operations saw a sizable minority of Irish Catholics living in Northern Ireland join the new Irish Republican Army. We'll just call it the IRA hereafter for simplicity. The IRA and its political wing Sinn Féin believed that steps towards Irish unity was the best way to achieve equality. Fast forward then to the 1990s and a peace process emerges due to, in my view, a political and military stalemate. There's a bit of debate on that in academic literature, if anyone's interested. By 1998, the major parties to the conflict, other than the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, signed the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement. It implemented things such as power sharing, started police reform, prisoner releases, and more. I won't go through the whole list because I'll bore you if I do so. In politics today, this is a very brief summary. There are essentially 5 main parties in Northern Ireland politics. So first you have Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican All-Ireland Party, who seek Irish unification. Next up, you have the Democratic Unionist Party, who want to keep Northern Ireland British. The same belief about keeping Northern Ireland within the UK is for the Ulster Unionist Party, but I'm sure, like we'll discuss this evening, there are differences between the DUP and UUP. Next up is the Social Democratic and Labour Party, or SDLP, known by its acronym, who also are an Irish nationalist party. They do want Irish unification, but certainly in the past, in the more medium to longer term, than Sinn Féin, and they were against the IRA's campaign during the conflict. And last of all is the Alliance Party, as we're talking about main political parties, which is a liberal, non-unionist, non-nationalist party who claim to be agnostic on the Irish unity question. I think for like a UK, England, Scotland, and Wales audience, basically they are affiliated with the Liberal Democrats, so that's one way of thinking about the Alliance Party. And that's it from me, so I'll hand over to John. Back to questions.
Okay, so the way this is going to run, I'm just going to ask a series of questions to the panel, which should last, I suppose, about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A for you to ask questions as well. So the questions are going to kind of run chronologically through the Northern Ireland peace process and then through into Brexit. That's the idea of the discussion. So, but to start, I suppose I'll start with Siobhan first. What we wanted to start with was the Good Friday Agreement, and looking back at the political institutions that were formed out of that, the power sharing executive and then the North-South Ministerial Council, and I guess the British Irish Council beyond that, and just the sort of positives and negatives of those institutions and structures. How do you reflect on them now?
So I think it's a really challenging thing when you think about the executive in particular, because as many of your students will know that power sharing at Stormont has been suspended on many different occasions. I think it's about kind of 5 distinct periods now where the institutions haven't been running for long kind of periods of time, and so the kind of 2 most recent chunks of that would have been from 2017 until 2020 following Brexit. Yes, and then again most recently I think from 2022 until just last year. So for very prolonged periods of time, the institutions aren't there. And I think that's largely due to the fact that we have this kind of compulsory power sharing mandatory coalition in place between the largest unionist party and the largest nationalist party, which was one of the really essential things in order to ensure that there was buy-in from both of the kind of major communities to ensure that the conflict could end. But at the same time, that mandatory coalition does make it quite challenging because if one political party chooses not to participate in the institutions, that means there is kind of no functioning government in place whatsoever. So I think to a certain extent, you could say for a very large amount of time since 1998 there has been power sharing structures in place, but for very prolonged periods there hasn't been. And so I think that'll be one of the biggest challenges when you look at the kind of successes and failures of the institutions, is just how easy it is perhaps to collapse institutions and how challenging it is to kind of get them back up and running again once they're down, because they tend to be mothballed for kind of several years at a time.
Yeah. What do you think, Giada?
Well, as I would say, the person in the panel that brings an outside perspective on the constitutional system that has been institutionalized by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, I would like to reflect on the fact that it is also its internationalization that has facilitated in some ways actors to commit to compromise. So I tend to look at the Good Friday Agreement, and I choose a Good Friday Agreement, just not always to repeat the Belfast Good Friday Agreement entire name. I tend always to look at it from a multi-level perspective, but in particular to look at those processes that have from somewhat the background helped to keep it together across turbulence and across crises such as Brexit has been. And one important element of that puzzle has been the European Union. Even if it is still very controversial when in public I say the European Union has played a leading role in keeping the institutions in Northern Ireland together, because for most of the people, the European Union didn't do much more than giving financial support through programs that have had a questionable impact on peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. But I think, and I'll try to keep this very brief, that there have been three main important impacts or three main important elements that have contributed to keep the institution alive and together, surviving the challenging of time. The first was the fact that even if the European Union did amount to more than 1 or 2 articles in the final text of the Good Friday Agreement, still the fact that there was an international European dimension provided an additional reasons for actors who had been involved into negotiating it and then to sign it. Well, it was much more difficult for them to turn their back to something that had been provided an additional layer of institutionalization. Then, the fact of having contributed to build that constitutional settlement within the European institutions, such as the European Council, or the European Parliament, and the European Commission, created a sort of interdependence between the layer of governance and between the actors, always often opposing actors, such as the MEPs, Ian Paisley and John Hume, who actually also had meetings in Brussels about the Good Friday Agreement. And this interdependence locked the actors in the process. And again, it was much more difficult for them to turn their back to this process that they had spent so much time negotiating. And lastly, this European element have also showed the power of the commitment of the European Union in supporting the peace process, not just from the top down, but also from the bottom up. And that has created, as I said, an additional layer that has become nonetheless locked into peace and peace building in Northern Ireland. And I think it's something that it is always forgotten or overlooked, and I always like to be the one in the room that brings it back.
Yeah. So Claire, what do you think? You've obviously researched constitutional power sharing. So from your research, what do you think is the success and failures?
Oh goodness, well that's an essay question in
Sorry,
itself.
it was a discuss, yeah.
Yes, I suppose looking at the model of power sharing that we have in Northern Ireland, it follows a fairly standard model, and the modalities of that then take on a specific shape. So we have a veto mechanism, for example, that is called the petition of concern in the Northern Irish context, and that in itself is a source of debate as to how effective or otherwise it is. It's been very heavily used, not always with the intention for which it was designed. So there are concerns there around the actual operations of consociationalism and power sharing and the effectiveness of that in a very practical sense. But I think more significantly, we have to think about what has been achieved politically in Northern Ireland over the last 27, 28 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And that is that we brought two essentially warring communities together to jointly govern. It hasn't been a steady path, and I think there would be more questions raised if it had been a smooth transition coming from such a protracted period of violent conflict. But that said, we're at a stage now where attention is turning more to the so-called bread and butter issues of politics every day. It's not just enough to say that it's okay that the institutions are up and running, that the political parties are together and co-governing Northern Ireland. Now people, and we have to remember as well, we've got a generation of people that were born post Good Friday Agreement who are now voting age, and they're engaging in politics in a different way to those who lived during the conflict. It's a very different lived experience that they have of life in Northern Ireland, and that's changing what politics needs to do. It's not just sufficient to have functioning institutions there, they need to be doing something, and that's changing the way that politics is being thought about. And that feeds into a much broader conversation that is gaining more traction over the last number of years around institutional reform, about the stability of the institutions, as has been mentioned, post-Brexit, about what Northern Ireland's future is, because for the the years prior to Brexit, that constitutional question, if we can call it that, was subsided a little bit because it was a conversation that happened within the broader architecture of the European Union. Now it's a question of Northern Ireland's future as being part of the United Kingdom or within the European Union as part of an Irish unification project. So there's a whole different dynamic of politics that's happening at the moment compared to 1998, and I think there needs to be a refocusing almost of the conversations that we're having about politics and what political stability looks like and indeed needs to look like going forward for people in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, yeah, because it's a question about what like success is, to turn it into an essay question, like what is success? Is it peace? Is it normalisation of politics? Is it normal parties, interacting with each other, and how you understand it? And like Siobhan said, the fact that it's had times where it's collapsed, and how we evaluate that. Sorry, I just got no, Thomas.
Don't worry. I'll try to say different things. Everyone said really good points. First thing I'd say positives. It dealt with the question about self-determination. And my view from research on Irish republicanism, you wouldn't have a peace agreement if that peace agreement didn't encapsulate within it what's it going to do about the question of self-determination for the people of Ireland. And this was actually, to be honest, that was agreed in 1993 in the Downing Street Declaration between the British and Irish governments, which kind of emerged from back-channel conversations with Sinn Féin and the SDLP in particular, but Sinn Féin was a novel part of it, which hadn't been there early in the conflict in terms of listening to what could produce peace from their perspective. And the self-determination, so you'd end up with a vote in the future, North and South separately but concurrently on the same day, so Northern Ireland and the Republic both have to say yes. Now, that's not me saying that's exactly what Sinn Féin wanted in the IRA, because it wasn't, because ultimately they did want a kind of all-Ireland referendum because they felt partition, as we said at the beginning, was undemocratic. But nonetheless, it did solve the problem about who decides the island of Ireland's future, North and South. And the British government implicitly is saying, it's not our decision to decide that. It's not something that Westminster is going to involve itself if there was a kind of repeat of like a Scottish independence referendum in Northern Ireland, and obviously the Republic, it can have a say. Second point, I think the veto parts are important in the power sharing and the Good Friday Agreement. So, with the cross-community votes over controversial things, flags, parades, policing, it's been important because it stops any return to discrimination that we saw pre-1969. And I think that's important that the cross-community vote is there on controversial issues to prevent any returns to one community or another feeling discriminated against. I think the direct rule provision, although it's not popular actually with unionists or nationalists, and it wouldn't be popular with Alliance either, in terms of if the government collapses, it goes back to direct rule from Westminster. It's not a popular option, but it gives a backup. So if the power sharing fails, it's not a kind of question of, well, hang on, this has failed. What are we going to do? Because there is a backup option from British government, direct rule, alongside Irish government having a consultative role in that. And I think the point that's really important, picking up from what our other speakers have said, the rates of violence, and that's not paramilitaries, and obviously during the conflict you had state violence as well, but it's significantly decreased. If you look at the number of people, I say this in class to students, if you look just at the number of people who died because of conflict-related instances, 1990 to 1995, and bear in mind there were ceasefires late 1994, it was something like 400 plus people. If you look at the same rate between 1999 up to, I don't know what that is, 2004, it's significantly lower. And that's not to belittle that it's still there. It's just saying there's aspects of this peace agreement that clearly work because of the main parties and participants in the conflict have, in a sense, withdrawn. So the IRA, the British troops are off the streets, etc. So things have changed. Loyalist paramilitaries still exist, but in a different guise and set up than what they were during the conflict. The one thing that I think is a disadvantage, just touching on that, and has been negative. Okay, so about the British government's role in the peace process, and I've got 3 quick examples to show this. On decommissioning of weapons, which is something I'm looking at the moment, the peace agreement said in 1998 the IRA was supposed to decommission its weapons by 2000, and in return, the British government and unionists were supposed to deliver things like power sharing, police reform, what was the other one? What Republicans call demilitarization, so troops off the streets and security installations down, at least the timetable. That didn't happen. Then we look at other things like the Irish unity question. I think this is a massive oversight in a sense for the Irish government, SDLP and Sinn Féin from the peace agreement. Okay, so self-determination is granted, but it's the British Secretary of State, as far as I can see, that decides when do the polls show that we could have a vote. Now, I think the British Secretary of State, because I don't think the Westminster government sees Northern Ireland as valuable for in terms of like economics for the UK, etc. So I do think probably they would grant a poll, but you don't know. It depends what government's in power. If there had been a majority consecutively in the north for a unification poll, there's always been in the south since you go back in the conflict about 60% plus in terms of if they want it, not in terms of the type of unification. But my point with that is, what if the British government says, no, we're not going to allow you to have that referendum? They could do that, and there's no kind of mechanism to prevent them from doing so. And the last example is conflict legacy. There was an agreement in 2014 called the Stormont House Agreement where all the main parties said, this is how we're going to deal with conflict legacy. And then the last British Conservative government tore that up and unilaterally put through, in all but name, an upfront unconditional amnesty act. So the point I'm making there is I don't think the peace agreement stipulated enough what is the British government's role in managing this process. And it presumes that all British governments would be reasonable and stick to the account of the Good Friday Agreement. And that hasn't always been the case. Yeah, so that's my thought.
Can I just add to that as well? Just to pick up on the point about the role of the Secretary of State, it has actually been tried through the courts as well to reach a determination as to whether or not the Secretary of State is obliged to publish criteria as to when they would call a border poll, and it's been found that the Secretary of State is under no legal obligation to do that. So to very heavily re-emphasise the point that you made, it depends on who is in office at a particular time, what the government of the day is thinking, what the wider political climate of a point of time is as to whether or not a border poll is called. And as you rightly say, all of the conditions in theory could be met that show there would be inclination or support within Northern Ireland towards Irish unity. But if the UK government decides that it doesn't want to call that poll, or the Secretary of State in that situation, then it won't happen. So it's very much in the hands of the UK government as to what the future of Northern Ireland is constitutionally in many ways.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to come in on that, Pilroy?
I would just say that I would summarize exactly what you said with the concept of administrative culture. Administrative culture in Northern Ireland, I think, would have and has had a big role to play in the British government attitudes towards the peace process, and it depends very much. It is very much locked with what type of government is in power in the center, but also how far the NIO and the Secretary of State are willing to detach and differentiate themselves from the central government. And so it is all connected also to the territory and UK territorial politics. It's something I'm really writing in this moment, so that's why I just came in on that.
What did you want to come in?
Oh yes, I think it's a really fascinating aspect of this, and I think particularly as there's so many polls show that support for Irish unity is growing, so I think it's something that's going to be kind of much more in the spotlight, particularly that push for that criteria to be made clear from the British Secretary of State, because you could argue that whether it's that when it looks like the numbers are getting close to 50%, that's when you need to call the referendum and start the preparations, but equally you could argue that some people would try and argue that it should be when the polls are looking at it as higher than 50%, then there's the argument that that's a smoother transition and less volatility there. And I think that perhaps for some people who are perhaps to be nationalist or Republican voters might previously have thought that the Labour Party would have been more sympathetic towards calling a border poll than perhaps the Conservative Party would have. But equally, I think that wouldn't necessarily be something that would be guaranteed, because I imagine even for any British Labour Prime Minister, they wouldn't want the kind of dubious accolade of being seen as the Prime Minister who oversaw the union being broken up. So even if they might be slightly more sympathetic towards the idea, I think it would be seen as kind of perhaps a negative aspect of their legacy. So I think when it comes down to it, there would always be the argument to just wait another 5 years and wait for the next Prime Minister and the one after that. So I think it would be a really interesting thing, but I imagine most Secretaries of State would be quite happy to kind of kick the can down the road for as long as possible and have it be someone else to make the determination on.
Can I say one thing related to that? Just because it's really interesting, the comments. It's jogged my head that, of course, we have one precedent, right, with what happened in Scotland 10 years, was it 10 years ago, 2014?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, okay. And so at that stage, the polls were showing, independence was going up. I think some near the end were showing it was almost 50-50, but it was never like a clear majority. So I wonder if that will come into this debate, because the British government set a precedent there that it will allow like an independence referendum if polls are showing some favourability to it. So it brings into the points we said, if it's showing like in Northern Ireland 55-60% maybe in the future, well, the Scottish independence referendum was called and there definitely wasn't that level of support at the time. And then, you could then argue, I'm not a massive academic on Scottish politics, but things I have read, some people would argue, well, Cameron's government allowed that to be called to kind of call the bluff at a point where they wouldn't get the 50%. I think if they did that related, because of the Good Friday Agreement, there's regulation, I think, to this, and a set down of standards, if you like. If they attempted that with a border poll in the north, then I don't think it would go down without controversy, which maybe calling the poll in Scotland to some extent didn't, with nationalists anyway.
Yeah, we'll maybe come on to Irish unity later, but it does. I think it feeds into the next question. Really, is the idea of how much the Good Friday Agreement kind of pushed some of the cans down the road around things like decommissioning and police reform and things like that, which is kind of where we go next. Because if we go chronologically, the next big point was the St Andrews Agreement of 2006-7. So by Thomas started, he was talking about the different parties in Northern Ireland. By 2006, the two largest parties were the DUP and Sinn Féin, and it was indeed the St Andrews Agreement. So I'm kind of interested in that, or we're interested in that question around how we got there and why it happened the way it did, why that the agreement between what historically been two very divided parties came together and how they formed the St Andrews Agreement. So I don't know where we go next. I guess we'll go to, why don't we start with you?
Well, as you rightly said, one of the key moments around that was the change in the political dynamics. We went from the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP being the two main parties to the two parties at the extremes of the political spectrum, Sinn Féin and the DUP, in the positions of power. So that was a change in context that made it, in a sense, more palatable for an arrangement to be met. These were the two parties that had to be in agreement with what was happening going forward, and it effectively just made the context a much easier one to work in to an extent. I think as well what we need to look at is by the time we got to 2006, 2007, albeit it had been a very fractured and stop-start way of doing politics and power sharing up to that point, but it was an opportunity to see how power sharing was working in practice in Northern Ireland. So whereas in 1998 the conversations were happening almost in a vacuum where it was unclear what exactly power sharing would look like in practice, by the time we got to that stage, there was a sense of the issues that remained that needed to be dealt with, that needed a little bit more focus. Indeed, even some of the St Andrews Agreement dealt with refinements as to the operations of the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive itself. So it was a different type of conversation that was happening then. It was more about how politics was working as opposed to what it could look like in a shared governance of Northern Ireland. So I think that the opportunities were there for those conversations to happen. And we were fortunate enough at the time that there were characters as well in play that were willing to have those conversations. And indeed, the outworking of the St Andrews Agreement, we saw the emergence of a very unlikely political friendship in many ways between the leaders of Sinn Féin and the DUP and First Minister and Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland. And that arrangement, the optics of that very much set the tone for what the working relationships needed to be thereafter between particularly those two political parties at the ends of the spectrum and the parties that fell in between those two ends. And we saw a relatively okay period of governance in Northern Ireland. Indeed, there were still stop-starts, but we had at least one full term after that, and that's something that in many ways it's used almost as a criticism of Northern Ireland that that's all you've achieved, so to speak, but it's something that does need to be celebrated, because I think even at that stage it was still in its infancy in many ways, the whole power sharing arrangement and the idea of that peace process and the conflict transformation process in Northern Ireland. And yeah, the way the politics developed from there really has a lot to learn from that period. But I think there were to sum up, there were a number of different factors that come into play with why St Andrews was able to come about and what it was able to achieve.
Yeah. Siobhan, you've written on this, what I've read about what you've written about this. What are your reflections? What's almost 20 years on now from St Andrews?
Yes, I think it's one of the, it was really interesting, perhaps kind of ironies of that period of time, that it was after the SDLP and the UUP had negotiated the peace settlement. Then, you know, in many ways, the kind of crowning glory for their political careers, they were then had their backs turned on them by the electorate. He then kind of went to the DUP and Sinn Féin to then look to kind of take over the helm at Stormont. And I think it's perhaps because of a certain sense within the electorate of feeling slightly vulnerable, perhaps, and kind of then turning to hardliners because they're wanting to see the kind of more extreme political representatives then being involved in power sharing at Stormont. And I think ultimately how the DUP and Sinn Féin were able to make that work was, I think they're very pragmatic, and there was a certain element of pressure that if they hadn't been able to make it work, whether that would have looked at, you know, directory from Westminster again, or else the parties perhaps turning back to the SDLP and the UUP. So I think it was a very pragmatic arrangement that there's a lot of pressure on them from their own voters and broader society to make things work and to see kind of Stormont be a success at that stage.
Yeah, in a relatively short period, I think from 1998 to 2006, you know, some of the things that we're talking about in policing and the role of the First Minister, these are big questions. I was really quite surprised how quickly, like we're filming this in Wales, so devolution has evolved a lot in Wales. So really that's how we look at it, sort of evolution of devolution, that it wasn't it wasn't just an event, it was much more than that. And it's interesting how Northern Ireland has, you know, that St Andrews Agreement is a similar kind of event. Giada, what do you think?
I would just add an element of what you very rightly said, and however, just with a caveat that I haven't written about it yet, so I have, it's just based on my field work very recently. The period between 1998, in the period between 1998 and 2006, on the behind the curtains, there was probably what has been the most skillful team of civil servants placed in key posts in the Northern Ireland office and in the NICS, the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Because of a whole administrative culture that had developed before the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, civil servants at that point were incredibly thrown into the limelight of politics in a way that was unimaginable to their Westminster counterpart, which also means that they were actually able to orchestrate and structure the talks that led to the St Andrews Agreement in a way that actually actors like McGuinness and Paisley were brought together, not forcibly, but the conditions and the environment had been created in a way that people trusted each other, that by then there was 10 years of habits of talking. And those processes of talking had also been institutionalized in the mechanism of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, with all the forums and the interactive arenas that underpinned the three strands. And following then a culture of talking and keep people talking, which is the subtitle of my next book, I'm sorry, we got to what has been the St Andrews Agreement, with a strong cooperation also in particular from the Northern Ireland Department of the Taoiseach, that also by then had imposed people that had been there for another 15 years and had been really in the habits of cooperating with the NICS and NIO civil servants on a weekly basis, because like I tracked down meetings between the three civil services that like happened on a weekly basis, and at times even twice a week. While before 1998, communications were almost closed and everything had to build up. And also, there were really the head of the political service in the NIO had a PhD in Irish history. he was incredibly skillful even in how to talk to people. Nigel Hamilton, that was the head of the NICS, another person that had really in the habit of cooperating with its counterpart in the NIO, and that knew almost by first name all his counterparts in Ireland. And all these people coming together and structuring the talks, I think also helped in shaping what was the environment that led to the St. Andrews Agreement.
It's a really interesting perspective. I think it's often, you're right, it is often completely overlooked. The idea that people behind the scenes are part of this, that once you get people talking and parties talking, then, because I think, personally, I think to go from 1998 to 2007, the idea that, say, Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley would even sit together, let alone be First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and put together what is, some parts of St Andrews are really significant for both parties.
And the only thing I would say is that they didn't wake up one day and said, "Oh, let's talk."
No.
They were actually brought
Your argument is there's loads of
by
people like that, yeah.
mechanisms and machineries that had been in place and had been designed by civil servants.
Thomas, do you
Okay, I'm going to talk about decommissioning, just because it's something I've written about recently. But only up to 2001, because the other government files aren't released. But I think the argument, well, we'll see, it might hold water after 2001, because the IRA's first decommissioning act is October 2001, and the state papers from the UK. The Irish ones are actually released beyond that, if you're interested, but the UK ones aren't yet. Although they might be this year, but not up to 2005 when the IRA decommissioning finishes. I think on decommissioning, my view on this is that, and I think this was obviously a major roadblock to getting power sharing going, essentially because the DUP in particular, when they overtake the UUP, make it absolutely clear, unless the decommission is finished and unless the IRA has left the scene in some way, then, yeah, essentially we're not going into government with Sinn Féin. So then you ask the question, well, what changes once you get to 2006-07 with this? If we start with the IRA and Sinn Féin on this, to be fair, my view on this would be their attitude was always, from the minute the IRA ceasefire in August 1994, if you deliver and if decommissioning is something that is needed to alleviate fears on the other side about sincerity of Republicans and peace, we can do that. But if it's set up as some kind of, as they saw it, like surrender process, that's focused on them and them delivering their weapons before there's other reforms delivered. So I've kind of phrased it as like, we do things, you do things. And you see this in the Good Friday Agreement, again, point I mentioned earlier, because on decommissioning it says the IRA delivers decommission by 2000. Obviously that doesn't happen. But that's also because, okay, power sharing did get going in 1999, in fairness, and it was up and down. So on that part, in fairness to unionism, they had met one of, if you like, Republicans' criteria about power sharing needed to get up and running. It wasn't dependent on the IRA decommissioning, and the Good Friday Agreement actually doesn't say opposite to that. The second thing, okay, so unionists would have been involved in this, and the British government, the Sinn Féin and the Republican movement would have been unsure about the reforms to the police, the RUC, and how sincere that was going to be. And the Royal Ulster Constabulary, I should have said for anyone who doesn't know about this, is just that it was a police force in Northern Ireland during the conflict. It was overwhelmingly British Protestant in terms of its makeup. So what Republicans wanted in particular is you needed a police force that was able to police in the Irish nationalist communities and be accepted and not seen as essentially a pro-unionist police force. So that was a sticking point. And then the whole business we talked about earlier, demilitarisation, and what they wanted with this, and this has been really interesting from looking at British government, Irish government state papers, they weren't unrealistic and said, you've got to get all the British troops out of here tomorrow or return them to the barracks, and we want all the security installations down. What they asked for was a timetable. And the sense I get also from then interviewing Republicans, who are not the leadership, the kind of grassroots in the Republican movement, they said, on the ground, this stuff really mattered because people were saying, well, you're coming here to leadership saying there's peace, but British soldiers are still on the streets and the IRA could be gone. So what if this all kicks off again and loyalists attack, for example, the Republican community? We have no defence. And that's important to go back to 1969 because that's how, whether we agree with that or not, is a separate debate. But the IRA and Sinn Féin saw the weapons as, going on the attack, but also defending their own communities. So I think that's an important point. Okay, so then why do they give up the weapons and the point they do? Because I think by 2005 there had been movement by the British government. So 2003 they start to outline some kind of demilitarisation timetable. They don't confirm that till 2005. Interestingly, once the IRA says our campaign's finished, I think it's literally the day after Peter Hain, as the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, says, okay, this is the demilitarisation plan, and all the troops will be withdrawn to barracks or back to England, Scotland or Wales by 2007. So I think that's interesting what Giada said, like stage managed, basically. We'll see what the archives say when the papers are out. I think they were a little bit into a corner because of various controversial incidents. But the other point by that stage, if we look at the DUP on the other side of this, yeah, okay, they could say, well, Sinn Féin has to back the police. The IRA's gone. The IRA had to decommission all its weapons. But for the DUP, and you see this, for example, in what Jonathan Powell talks about, and other academics have mentioned this in their work, like John Tong's book, Sophie Whiting, etc., on the DUP talks about this. For the DUP side of it, so it might look like it's all a game, but what was going on in the background, again, with British civil servants, people like Jonathan Powell said, right, the IRA is now delivered, so the DUP needs to step up and power share. If they don't do that, then there was this idea of like Plan B, which was more Irish government involvement with British government direct rule. The DUP would be dead against that. So I think there was pressure also applied to them, and then all the other factors everyone talked about kind of coalesced around that. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Cool. Right. So the next few questions, the sort of topic we're going to look at is Brexit. And the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland politics. But I think it's probably useful just to start off maybe just the two of you, just talking about the idea, because you've both researched on Europe and Brexit. We're going to start with Claire and then come to Charlie, who've already kind of mentioned it a little bit. Just the impact of the European Union or the European dimension, however you want to frame it, around the impact of the peace process before Brexit, and then we'll move on to the sort of the Brexit period. What do you think the impact of Europe has been?
Oh goodness, I don't think it can be underestimated, to put it mildly. We've touched on the idea of the multi-level architecture that was in place. And I've mentioned already that it kind of made the salience of the constitutional question in Northern Ireland a little bit, not lower down the agenda in terms of shaping how people thought about the constitutional question, but as a political priority, it wasn't something that needed necessarily to be dealt with in the here and now. So it took a little bit of pressure off what the institutions and the political parties needed to be doing, in a sense, at the early stage of the peace process post-1998. Effectively, the role of the European Union has been one of contributing, albeit imperfectly so in many ways, as I know Giada has touched upon and might pick up on as well, to that broader peace process within Northern Ireland. But it was only, whenever it came to the referendum in 2016 on the UK's membership of the European Union, and then in the negotiations and the post-Brexit period now that we're in, that actually the role of Europe in a more practical sense, not just in a symbolic, we're part of the European Union and this is what the benefits of membership are indeed not. It became much more a question of, well, actually, what does this mean on the ground in Northern Ireland in terms of everyday life? How does that relationship with Europe shape not just what people are experiencing in terms of their everyday lives, but what that means for how they're thinking about the constitutional question going forward? And indeed, we have seen since Brexit, and I said this having recently co-authored a book in the Alliance Party where we spoke to members, and one of the things we asked them was around their constitutional preferences going forward. And we saw that there was a leaning within the party towards the idea of Irish unification, but when we dug into the data a little bit further, we saw that, as we knew already, it's a very pro-European party. So that question of Northern Ireland's constitutional future is very heavily tied to the role of the European Union and what that is perceived to bring to Northern Ireland going forward. Now, we're in a context today where we know there are trade tariffs and a changing economic climate, let's say, stemming from the United States. That's putting Northern Ireland in a very challenging situation because it's part of the United Kingdom, so it's subject to the tariff arrangements there, but it's also through the Windsor Framework provisions with relation to trade, kind of tied in with the arrangements of the European Union, which is facing a higher level of tariffs. There is a question mark there over what the practical implications of that will be for Northern Ireland going forward. And I digress a little bit, but to make the point that the broader influence of the European Union isn't just something that's idealistic in a sense now for Northern Ireland or tied necessarily just to the peace process. It's something that more people are aware of in a much deeper way with regard to everyday life in Northern Ireland now.
Yeah. So you're basically saying that Donald Trump didn't consider Northern Ireland or other factors when he, but surprise me.
We're coming from a situation where we had Joe Biden as president, who's widely proclaiming to be one of the most Irish presidents that there had ever been. So it's quite a sea change to go from that to a context where even only a few weeks ago we had politicians and civil society and business representatives in Washington representing Northern Ireland over the St. Patrick's Day celebrations. You have to question what the benefit of that was. Normally you hear people coming back saying that, you know, it's been positive and productive and lots of conversations, and now we're in a situation where it's almost speaking into the void when it comes to the top tier of politics in the United States, and that will have ramifications for Northern Ireland, the island of Ireland, and indeed the UK going forward. So it's again another level to this picture as well.
Well, Giada, it's a free hit for you. The European Union before Brexit.
I'm going to bring it much more to the, let's say, practical everyday life type of aspects, because Claire has already touched very well to the constitutional question. One of the main and leading contributions of the European Union to the Northern Ireland peace process, I think, has been the one of thinking about people. Thinking about the everyday life of people in Northern Ireland and how trying to make a change for them, and especially facilitating the move from conflict to peace. That had absolutely nothing to do with AI politics, but was simply and pragmatically thinking about people. There were issues to deal with, the legacy of the past. What does reconciliation mean? How do you reconstruct the infrastructure that had been destroyed during the conflict by the violence, etc. And that's exactly why the peace programs, the European Union peace programs, have been designed to help people transitioning from conflict to peace, but also somewhat to empower people at the grassroots level to take ownership of their own peace process. What the high politics were not at that moment concerned with, more busy in trying to keep the institutions and the power sharing working. There is a lot of debate on the fact that the peace program have not attained fully their objectives. And I agree with that. And I also have always been very specific on trying to point out exactly why the peace programs haven't been able to achieve bringing the divided communities together, bringing reconciliation in practice, which I would summarize with that there is an implementation gap. Because when policies are designed at the supranational level without taking into account the contested nature of the grassroots level of the society, there is always something that doesn't unfold in the way that you thought it would be. Nonetheless, there was money. And there was the only money available to those small groups around the whole of Northern Ireland to deal with the victims and the survivors. Also, in the language of the European Union, everyone was a victim of the conflict. There was no victims and perpetrators. And also, speaking about legacy and connecting with what Tom has just said, the European Union dimension is the only dimension in which reconciliation has been defined, and through 5 points. While at the moment, with the last Legacy Act, there is all this talking about reconciliation, while no one is able to define on the British side what reconciliation means. So what the European Union and what was really the contribution of the European Union to peace in Northern Ireland, with all its shortcomings, was to at least being able to design a process that was for the people. And it's probably also what the British government should do in thinking about legacy. You need to think about the people you are designing and devising the process for. And as Claire pointed out very well, the value of all of this was just realized in 2016. Because, well, I hadn't published my first book yet, so.
Siobhan, did you want to come in at all on any of that?
Yes, so just I very much agree with all of that, just in terms of the role that the EU has played, and I think I was always just struck by the fact that I think one of the biggest criticisms that Brexiteers would have had of the EU probably would have been perceived as one of its strengths in the North, that this idea that the EU was perhaps this kind of arm's length, faceless bureaucrats to a certain extent and quite detached from day-to-day kind of domestic politics. although that was what kind of was frustrating for some pro-Brexit supporters, I think that was in many ways one of the EU's strengths in the north, the fact that they were seen as kind of a place removed, and so perhaps slightly more impartial in being able to kind of whenever they were able to make interventions, it wouldn't have been seen as controversial as if, British government funding or Irish government funding. And as Clara touched on in particular, I think it's going to be one of those things that if there is a referendum campaign that possibly could sway some votes for younger voters, this idea that by voting to have a united Ireland, that is kind of being able to have EU membership again, and perhaps being able to take back some of those kind of positive aspects of EU membership that have been lost for people in the north. So I think it'll be one of the interesting ones in terms of the future debate.
Yeah, that supranational aspect I think is really interesting. Thomas, do you want to briefly talk
Yeah,
about
my
it?
only thoughts on this, I'm not an EU expert like lots of our panel members, so I'm not going to mention too much about that. I think that what I've been interested in the last few years is like, what were the Democratic Unionist Party, what were they attempting to do with Brexit? Because the only logic I can see, and we talked about this earlier with me and Siobhan in another conversation, that was a hard border. Because, when Theresa May tried to put her deal through Parliament that would have kept all of Northern Ireland within some kind of backstop, I think that's what it was called, wasn't it? And they rejected that. So, because they said it was still too closely associated with the European Union, etc. So, for me, I then got quite interested in this in the period outside of my main research. Like, what's behind this? What's the thinking? And I think the logic in my head, trying to find a logic of what they were doing, is that ultimately they never liked the European Economic Community, and then they never liked the EU, and simply because of this idea, like, it diminishes borders. I mean, there was this thing in the 1980s, with the DUP leadership then under Revenue and Paisley Senior. It was going on about there's too many Roman Catholics in Europe compared to Protestants. So there's that side of it, but I think most of the DUP is actually just essentially because, from their perspective, you don't want to have a diminished border between the north and the south of Ireland, because then it might lead people to question, well, why do we have a border in the first place? And the European framework linked into that conversation, I think, from their perspective. I also think it's important to bear in mind things that happened politically, like the flag protests in 2010s at Belfast City Hall. So essentially the Sinn Féin, the SDLP and Alliance put this bill through, which meant the Union Jack wouldn't fly 365 days of the year, every single day. So it'd be more in line with the UK, like on monarchs' birthdays, Armed Forces Day, etc. And the DUP and loyalists in particular were protesting against this. And why I'm mentioning that, because I think it goes into what we were saying, like demographics, that, the DUP in this sense would be smart and on top of what's happening in the wider polls and population changes. So I think, they saw Brexit as an opportunity to make it clear, like, this is Northern Ireland and it's within the UK, that's the Republic. And if you think about it, if Northern Ireland had left on like a hard Brexit like the rest of the UK, that's quite difficult to untangle if you end up with a United Ireland framework, because you might have totally different simple things like product standards, standards of healthcare. So I think that was what was behind it. And also this, quote from Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and he called Sinn Féin and the DUP like serial negotiators. And I think what's the DUP, again, I'm trying to just follow the logic of it, whether people agree with it or not, it's a separate debate. I think they try to kind of transfer that, which they feel they've been quite good at, related to power sharing and getting concessions with Sinn Féin and other parties, to a much broader framework with the UK government and then the EU. But the problem with that is that Northern Ireland, bar a few occasions when there's not a majority in Westminster, generally the MPs don't matter. I mean, there's only 18 of them, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, yeah, the strategy didn't work. And I think they tried to transfer that strategy onto a broader, almost European framework, and it failed, basically. Because the UK government and what was in with Boris Johnson was more with opinion polls. And I might have mentioned this before, there was a YouGov poll, I think it was, and it asked Conservative Party members, would you be happy to have a hard Brexit if it meant Northern Ireland might end up leaving the UK? And the majority of them, a slight majority, but a majority, said yes. So you look at it from Boris Johnson's head, it made sense why he ditched the DP. And I think that, that in a sense for the DUP, that's the kind of logic in my head behind what they were attempting to do, but it didn't work.
Did you want to come back?
Yeah, just to sort of add to that from the perspective of what was going on within Northern Ireland to an extent at that time, I don't think there was a sense that anyone thought that the Leave campaign would actually win overall. So for the DUP, it was an opportunity to really create a very strong position on it for political opportunity, in a sense, you know, to really differentiate itself as a party. With a very clear perspective on the Brexit question, and to align itself in many ways with the Leave campaigns in the rest of the United Kingdom as well. When the vote came through, I think the DUP and others in Northern Ireland who had advocated for Leave were almost as shell-shocked to an extent as we saw the UK government whenever that result came through. And I think it's fair to say I don't think many people, certainly in the political sphere, in any great depth had actually engaged with the idea of what Brexit would actually mean. There was obviously a loose conversation around the idea of it would mean a border somewhere and what that would look like. But I think it was more a political tactic in some senses for the DUP and for those within unionism who supported the Leave idea. To show that they were effectively opposed to the idea of, as you said, this sort of open border mindset, particularly with regard to the island of Ireland. And I say as somebody as well that lives in the border regions, this is quite removed from what was actually happening on the ground. People along the border were very aware of the fact that it's not just a question of sort of a territorial demarcation and something that would look a little bit different. It was very fundamental to everyday life as well. So it's not just, you know, a gradual gap that might emerge in regulatory terms north and south of the border. It was simple things such as, will I be able to, you know, I live in the north and work in the south, will I be able to go to work in the south? What does that mean for my pension? What does it mean for companies that are trading cross-border as well? Very fundamentals, and even I remember at the time there were images coming forward of even road markings that were different. It would have shared roads and everything really was thrown into disarray around those conversations. And I think the impact of that, very much in the case of Northern Ireland, is one that has not been favourable, let's say, for the DUP. Ultimately, in terms of the outworking, it has led to a lot of internal challenges, let's say, within the party. It's led to a disintegration or a breakup within unionism itself. The vote is split so widely now that unionism is struggling with regard to consolidating its own representation, particularly at Westminster level. And the ramifications of that decision are still playing out very much so for unionism, but I don't think it's an outcome ultimately that unionism and the DUP in particular actually expected to be dealing with.
Shall we? I've got a kind of list of questions, but I think I'd like kind of just deviate from that a bit. And we've looked at the DUP and sort of consequences of Brexit, but I'm mindful that we haven't really talked about Sinn Féin and the consequences of Brexit. I don't want to like dump a question on you there, but if we looked at the DUP and that, you know, I think that's right that the party has really struggled, because I don't think they expected, as you say, didn't expect that suddenly they're dealing with actually leaving the European Union, and then that period of transition which seemed to go on, well, did indeed go on for years and years. What do you think it's meant for Sinn Féin, I mean, north and south, and how it's positioned itself since Brexit?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I would very much agree that I think the DUP didn't expect the Brexit vote to go the way that it did. I don't think that Sinn Féin anticipated it either, and although Sinn Féin and the SDP as well, both nationalist parties had campaigned very strongly against Brexit, I think in a kind of obscure roundabout way, it's very much advanced their arguments in terms of Irish unity, so they have kind of benefited from it overall. And I think in particular, if you see the kind of the nationalist vote is very much kind of coalesced around Sinn Féin, and I think at the same time when the DUP has become quite fractured around Brexit, I think that was one of the main drivers behind the fact that you know, Sinn Féin were able to take the kind of First Minister position at Stormont for the first time, with the DUP then taking the kind of second position as Deputy First Minister, because the sense of kind of the nationalist parties rallying around Sinn Féin party because of that Brexit stance, and then other parties can be more split on the unionist end of the spectrum. So I think there's been a number of kind of benefits for Sinn Féin in terms of just being able to maintain that vote, while the DUP has been essentially in disarray for about 3 or 4 years. And I do get the impression that they have kind of realised that the entire Brexit argument for them isn't something that they're going to win for themselves or for their own voters, so they've perhaps just tried to drop that. And it's been quite interesting in the last kind of 6 to 12 months, they've very much been trying to focus on more of the bread and butter issues. So you see their MLAs at Stormont are much more likely to be on their feet talking about healthcare waiting lists or people trying to access a GP or a dentist, you know, rather than trying to talk about those bigger ideological kind of constitutional aspects. So I think the DUP is probably aware of that, is trying to focus on those more kind of tangible issues for their voters. They perhaps see that as a stronger territory, which is what the SDLP and Sinn Féin would have been doing for years before that.
Do you think, maybe ask Thomas as well on this, do you think how has that impacted Sinn Féin in the south? You know, because there's, you know, because obviously Sinn Féin, there were times where, you know, they went sort of neck and neck with Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and whether they might actually form a government. What impact do you think Brexit's had on Sinn Féin and the Republic of Ireland? I think
bizarrely it's maybe kind of been a negative for Sinn Féin in the south, because we saw for the first time, you know, a Fine Gael government, so Flair Varadkar as Taoiseach at the time, taking a very strong stance against Britain, whereas, you know, in many ways he was taking on some of the quite Republican tone or style that you normally would have associated with Sinn Féin politicians. So I found it quite interesting that it was almost to a certain extent Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael started to steal the clues of Sinn Féin in the south in terms of being seen to kind of wrap the Irish tractor around them and be taking on the British government around Brexit issues. So I thought that was interesting. I think it did move the dial very much in terms of how kind of across the political spectrum in Ireland, how British kind of politics would have been perceived. So I do wonder if there would have been a certain, kind of, it would have limited Sinn Féin's having a specific offering compared to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in terms of how they would have approached Britain at the time.
Yeah. Thomas?
My thoughts, I think that's super interesting, because I think that it's in the north with Sinn Féin, I'd say McAvoy and others, Queen's University Belfast released this report, I think it's 2018, it's called Northern Ireland, the Brexit Report, and it used this word, I think it's right, what the Brexit referendum did was like mainstream Irish unification. I think we talked about this earlier, Siobhan, as well. It wasn't just something that Sinn Féin was talking about. Suddenly the SDLP were talking more about it. The Irish government with Varadkar, exactly what we were saying there, was starting to, you know, certainly engage with that debate, like formally in a public arena. So I think that Brexit had that effect because, and it comes back to Claire and others' work, like with Alliance, that, if people, you had people in republicanism and then nationalism who would always think about unification, but then there's this opportunity, if you like, which has been caused by basically the British government and unionists to an extent as well by the DUP. And I think with Alliance, as exactly, that's great that Claire talked about the statistics, because that's why that's such an important bit of the book, isn't it? It's so interesting that, you know, that's a worry, I think, in some respects of the DUP, because you've got this middle ground, and the way I would view it, in a similar sense, I guess, the Scottish independence referendum, I think you're always going to have like 30 to 35, maybe to 40% of unionism and nationalism saying, and those two blocks, unionism and nationalism, saying, I'm going to vote to keep Northern Ireland in the UK, or I'm going to vote to have a united Ireland. But because you've got these, you know, non-unionist or non-nationalist voters in the middle, like 15% or so of the electorate, they're actually going to be really important because they can swing this either way. So I think that was, I think that helped like mainstream debate about unification for this point that, where's this heading? Where's Brexit going? Where's the UK going, like financially? And I think that would be certainly, you know, for the Alliance voters would be important. I think it made Sinn Féin also, I put the word here, like look reasonable, but I mean to a broader audience because, you know, ultimately what they were arguing for was some kind of special status for North of Ireland or Northern Ireland within the EU. And that's what we end up. And basically the Irish government, to an extent, adopts that approach. And the SDLP. So it's not, you know, it made Sinn Féin look in step, if you like, with other nationalist parties. The second point about the South, I'm not going to add too much to that. And what is interesting, what Siobhan said, see, for Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, that was an area they could, if you like, become more Republican, because it's not questioning their ethos on things like socioeconomics, for example. That's different than, say, the electoral battle again with Sinn Féin in the South about socioeconomic conditions or healthcare. So, that was always going to be a difficult issue for Sinn Féin against Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil. And Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil were likely to do that, republicanise their kind of respective perspective on the Brexit situation, because it's directly affecting the South's economy and people's livelihoods potentially in the South. So, and I was just thinking in Southern Irish politics, you know, there's essentially like a left bloc and a right bloc. And at the moment, demographics-wise, generally we see in elections, the younger people are the more likely to vote for left parties, including Sinn Féin. The older people are the more likely to vote for Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil. So I think at the moment is kind of in stasis, but it will change, perhaps with generations, 10 or so plus years, that might change perspective with government formation there. But yeah.
That seems like a good place to go next, I think, is that sense of where we go next. But I think in a minute we'll talk about maybe potential unification. But I think we'll come back to Giada and talk about, the position of the European Union moving forward and post-Brexit. I don't really see the European Union, maybe because of what's happening with Trump and international affairs with Ukraine and other factors. But is the European Union still a factor in Northern Ireland? Where do you think that's going to go in the future?
Well, I would like to highlight one very important thing is that the peace program, the European Union peace program that I was talking about before, is the only financial program that has survived to the challenge of Brexit, which is something that is completely overlooked by anyone. Even just trying to search for newspapers coverage or debate that would mention the current provisions for Peace Plus, on the web we found almost nothing. And part of it, I think, is connected to what I was saying before, the implementation gap. So people tend still to be skeptical about the effective impact that taking part into the initiative founded by Peace Plus could have. Part of it is the political polarization that Brexit has had at the societal level. That has translated with loyalist project coordinators or participants taking part to the initiatives feel that they had to leave or not engage anymore in the European Union type of programs and initiatives because that would have contradicted the mainstream Brexit type of politics. Especially I'm talking about loyalist participants in loyalist areas that would tend to vote for the DUP. And I think that there has been a big overlooked from the institutions and also from the Northern Ireland Assembly when it sat again. Because the peace programs has been designed and built to tackle polarization. Mm-hmm. So if you want to build any type of future, any type of status for Northern Ireland, within or outside, with a special status also, if we have to be very careful to use this language, you have there an amount of money that is still considerable, to which both governments, the Republic of Ireland and the UK government, have committed to put matching funding that has been designed to tackle polarizations and to bring people together. And nobody talks about it. And nobody cares about it. On the European Union side, while certainly it has way bigger fish to fry at the moment, it's still proof of its enduring commitment to the Northern Ireland peace process. And for what I know right now, it hasn't declared any stop to the future of this funding.
Okay, so if we go to some questions from the audience, have anybody got any questions for the panel?
I'd like to ask you what the political parties and what the people of Northern Ireland feel about where we are now and where we might be going.
Then we're going to pick that.
Yeah, well, that very much ties in with the Windsor Framework, or what used to be the protocol in Ireland and Northern Ireland. There are different perspectives on it. Certainly from the unionist perspective, it's very contentious, the idea that there's any sort of a border, it's called the so-called Irish Sea border, as a result of Brexit, that implements any sort of differential treatment for Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the United Kingdom with regard to the movement of goods. that's something that the DUP in particular is very vehemently against. The DUP, and I take the point that was made earlier that the placed more of a focus since the return of the institutions on the so-called everyday issues of politics in Northern Ireland, but the Brexit issue and particularly the politics of the Windsor Framework as it now is and the operation of the trade arrangements post-Brexit are very much at the forefront of the DUP's minds and unionism more broadly. There are periodic votes that will be held within the Northern Ireland Assembly on the continuation of Articles 5 to 10 of the Protocol/Windsor Framework. Around the trade arrangements in Northern Ireland. The first one of those happened just before Christmas, and basically it means every either 4 or 8 years, depending on the outcome, there will be a vote, a democratic consent vote of sorts within the Northern Ireland Assembly on that issue. So it's not something that will go away quickly or easily. It's very much an embedded part of what Northern Ireland's politics now will look like going forward. And indeed, there's also a mechanism now that has been built into the Northern Ireland Assembly's arrangements, stemming from the Windsor Framework as well, called the Storm and Break. And that's essentially a process whereby it's quite similar to the way the petition of concern I mentioned earlier works, in that you need at least 30 signatures from MLAs from at least 2 political parties to sign it. And effectively, a case has to be presented to the UK government, ultimately outlining the ways in which any laws coming or potential laws coming from the European Union might impact on everyday life in Northern Ireland going forward. That was triggered, again, I think it was end of November, December time, just last year. It got as far as the UK government and ultimately the Secretary of State decided not to take it forward. But had that been taken forward, that would have been a route to effectively raising a flag and saying there's a concern here, and it would initiate a process of negotiation and conversation within the joint committee between the UK and the EU, and that's the body that oversees the Brexit arrangements. So in that sense, the issue of trade and friction on the East-West relationship is central to the dynamics of Northern Irish politics. At the moment, there isn't so much of an issue around North-South trade at the minute. I say that with an obvious caveat of today's developments with around the tariff situation. But the idea of maintaining a soft border on the island of Ireland and that trade can move north and south, that has been something that the whole Brexit negotiation and the Windsor Framework and its predecessor in the protocol tried to maintain. But of course the consequence of that is that there is a different set of arrangements in terms of East-West trade. Conversations are ongoing as to how that can be softened going forward, but ultimately, unless you've got the whole of the UK aligning to what's happening with the EU, there's always going to have to be something somewhere, and it will permanently be a piece of Northern Ireland's politics and political conversations going forward.
Anybody else want to come in on that?
I just think the only thing I would say, just from the conflict perspective, there's no way. This was the problem, in Brexit. There was never going to be a hard border again. And you think, during the conflict, there are British troops across that border. I'm not just talking about, say, if there's paramilitary attacks coming back and forth, whether they're loyalist or Republican. Also, like the smuggling that was going on, particularly in places like South Armagh, are particularly adept at this. And that was with, I don't know, I can't give you the precise figure, but thousands of British troops there, and RUC officers, and backup for that Ulster Defence Regiment. And they couldn't seal that. So it's just not a practical arrangement. So in the end, the idea, in my view, putting it in the sea, I don't see the border in the sea, like economically. That was really the only kind of option for it. And it comes back, I think Claire said this point earlier, you look at like the unionist vote, and it's being split now between quite a few parties. Comes back to, like that kind of storm and break business and having that vote every 4 years. And then they've got the problem, that the demographic problem for unionism. I don't see how they're going to be able to get a majority to implement this. But also, as we said, they're splitting their vote across various parties. So yeah, I think it was there. It's interesting, that part of the like Windsor frameworks and then Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, because it was obviously to placate unionists. I remember at the time, if I'm right as well, that unionists raised the concern, why is this not a cross-community vote? They wanted it on those terms, but Johnson put it in, no, it's just a majority vote within the Assembly. So I totally agree with Claire. I don't see this debate going away, and there is no way. It'd be interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting. We start getting major deviations in things like healthcare, food products between the UK and the Republic. yeah, that it might make some of this stuff harder to regulate. But they're not going to put hard border in. I don't see that happening.
Did you want to come back? Yeah.
Yeah, just to pick up on that last point, it's interesting because actually contained within the post-Brexit arrangements are a whole set of arrangements with regard to human rights in Northern Ireland, and there's a base level has been put in place that there won't. There's a commitment to a non-diminution of rights in Northern Ireland under Article 2, which places Northern Ireland on a different footing to the rest of the United Kingdom. But again, something that isn't being talked about is that Northern Ireland already operates a different human rights regime anyway. It's just the potential is there now for that to widen to a much greater extent, and we've already seen again through the courts that has been tested in terms of Article 2. And just to pick up on your earlier point as well, just with regard to the wider political dynamics, the DUP's decision to return to power sharing last year, they had initially identified 7 criteria that they wanted any amendments to the protocol to make or to reach as a basis for a return to power sharing. Under no assessment really could you say that those 7 criteria were met under the Windsor framework. There were still areas, but it was sufficient from the DUP's perspective to return to power sharing. But this is what contributed to the split within unionism that we have seen, because from particularly the perspective of the traditional unionist voice, the TUV party, the DUP were being criticised as selling out unionism and having done damage to the unionist cause by returning to power sharing without pushing for further measures within the Windsor framework arrangements. So that's another dynamic within the wider unionist conversation as well at the moment.
Yeah, I think we'll go to another question. I think it's interesting that civic society hasn't got more involved in this. Like, there's another tranche of changes coming in May, right? And you would clearly politics matters and constitutions matter, but business matters, right? Being able to trade where you don't have to have sort of import documentation between the Great Britain and Northern Ireland is important, and it's interesting that has really the constitutional issues seem to trump that all the time. But that's just the nature of Northern Ireland to some extent.
If I can add to that as well, the House of Lords Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee, and disclaimer, I was a witness given oral evidence to the committee recently. They're actually undertaking an inquiry at the moment around strengthening Northern Ireland's voice in the context of the Windsor framework. And one of the themes that's coming through so far from the committee's work and its predecessor in the last Parliament is that there's an issue of transparency as to how civil society, businesses, other stakeholders in Northern Ireland are actually able to effectively engage with the architecture of the Windsor framework and those arrangements going forward. So there's a bit of an issue there as well as to not just what's happening in the formal architecture sense, but how that's linking to what's going on the ground. And Giada mentioned earlier the idea of a gap between various levels, and that seems to be emerging in this regard as well.
Yeah. Should we go to another question? Anybody got anything else? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, do you think there's any possibility at all that a conflict like what we're seeing during the Troubles could ever happen again if the politics we're discussing were handled incorrectly? Or is that just completely unthinkable in such a long nation?
Who wants to start?
If you
Who?
Do you want to go?
Do you want to go?
Oh yeah, sure. I like to think it would be impossible to happen again. I think, in terms of where we're at as a society now, I think people just know that how things were in the past during the conflict was just so horrendous that people are so conscious of the emotional scars of that day to day. And I'd like to think that we'd never go back there. Having said that, I don't think we should ever take peace for granted. And I think one thing I'm always conscious of is that obviously the kind of main bloodshed of the conflict has stopped. There are still kind of some small paramilitary groupings that do continue to have access, very limited compared to what it would have been in the past, but access to some kind of weapons and ammunition. So it's something always to be kind of conscious of, whether there could be kind of some small scale violence, but I'd certainly like to think that we as a society would never go back just to how things were, considering I think on all sides from all perspectives there's it's the one thing people can agree on is that there has to be a way forward that isn't kind of going back to where we were.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Coming on that, so I have 3 points. One is that this is an interesting discussion because the British government recently had this idea they would outsource a kind of policy consultation about what do you do with remaining paramilitary groups. And there was a sense from across different parties in Northern Ireland that this might be worth attempting because other attempts that basically to get them on criminal charges and arrest them and other things, it hasn't led to the end of these groups. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes. There's obviously, the British government's keeping an eye on that, so there's obviously some concern related to that. I think more broadly, we do loyalism, republicanism. Republicanism first. I don't think so, because I think if you look at Sinn Féin and the advance of what some of the things they're trying to achieve, and then trying to, again, like mainstream Irish unification debate, I think they're on the road to that. So it makes no sense, I think, for republicanism to go down that route at all. And I think you start to see that not all, there's some what labelled as like dissident Republican paramilitary, so those against the peace settlement. There has been individuals within these groups that have said, right, this needs to stop right now. They wouldn't necessarily announce that, was their campaign right or wrong in the first place, but they just think there might be another pathway forward. Loyalism, I don't know. With that, there was a really interesting article, who was this by? A guy called Jeffrey Sluker in 2009. And he was saying at that point, his fear for the future of power sharing was loyalist paramilitary still exist. And there was, if you fast forward what he was saying in 2009, his concern was if there's ever potentially destabilization because of constitutional referendums, like a border poll, as it's sometimes labelled, what will loyalists do related to that if the result doesn't go their way? And what was interesting, I think this was last year or the year before, there was a police service in Northern Ireland, they came out and spoke about loyalists. I think it was during the Brexit period. And they said their concern was, there's a couple of hundred plus who are actively involved in them, and they therefore have contacts beyond themselves. And if there was a major kind of constitutional crisis, I guess, for loyalism, who knows what they would do? So, yeah, I don't know with loyalism. For republicanism, it would make no sense at all. For loyalism, I don't know. I couldn't give a strict answer on that. But it's interesting the British government with this recent policy, because they obviously, I think, have an eye to this if there's a way to solve, concerns that these groups might have.
On this, I just would like to come in what you said about loyalism. So I was in Belfast in January, and I did a lot of field work interviewing, in particular, leaders of working class loyalist areas in Belfast and Derry, Londonderry. And what really came out very powerfully from my field work was that those very relatively poor areas and where social issues are still very in front of everyone's eyes, and where there is still issues with crime and paramilitarism, well, those communities really felt left out from the peace process. That's the language that they used with me. And in particular, left out and disjointed from unionist politics, which means that also all work that is done to tackle the social issues that are experienced in those communities are done at the local level by often former paramilitaries that are trying to also push the new generations to fight for a better life. And one of the key issues that there is in those communities is underachievement. Young loyalist people that lives in those areas don't go to university, do not seek or see education as a way to emancipate, which is still very connected to the tradition and to the fact that before 1998, they could very easily get into stable employment, often that was passed through generations, or getting into the police service or in public services. It's not like this anymore. And while the trend has completely gone into the opposite way, into the nationalist communities, where educations were really seen as the way to improve their condition and the way to improve and build a better society, it hasn't been mirrored in loyalist communities. And that's a huge issue.
I agree with the points that have already been made. And just to add to those, we still have peace walls in Northern Ireland. Very much so. I think I'm right in saying they've actually increased in number since 1998. So that in itself is probably indicative of the fact that there's still an element of insecurity between the communities, and that very much ties in with what Giada was saying there as well. So I feel as long as there are issues such as paramilitary activity, social deprivation, issues in terms of everyday life in Northern Ireland more broadly, there's the opportunity there for that to be a kindle for something. I agree with Siobhan's point that there is a sense of hope in Northern Ireland that things would never return to the scale of violence that was seen previously. But, and again, to emphasise the point that Siobhan made, we can't just take it for granted that that will be the case. Peace needs to be something that is a continuous process and work towards. We saw with regard to Brexit, there were flare-ups in tension in a few pockets of Northern Ireland. That shows just how easily things can be tipped to an extent. How widespread that might become would obviously be very much a factor of the time and wider circumstance. But I think there's always the danger that things are volatile essentially in Northern Ireland, and it needs to be treated carefully with regard to whatever's on the agenda, be it politics, economics, healthcare policy, even the funding of the institutions in Northern Ireland and the civil service departments and wider bodies in Northern Ireland. All of these things build into that bigger picture as to the sustainability of peace in the region.
Do you want to come back, or are you okay? You okay? Okay, I think probably on that we'll probably wrap it up. So you could thank the panel in the usual way, that'd be grand. Thank you very much. Thank you.